the narrative about how the poor live and what are the expectations they have and what circumstances really tie them to the poverty situation they are facing. I think we have a long way to go, and for sure non-governmental institutions are the ones that could really help to change that narrative. And we need a lot more than nice stories and good evidence. We need to really build a more political narrative about it, and I completely agree with that. But I think we have a big challenge also in what Abhijit was saying, and bringing new ideas to governmental practice. You know, governmental systems change very slowly, and they need to adapt to new narratives in very complicated ways. So bringing new ideas to governments implies that we interact with governments. We really need to make that effort. And sometimes it's not easy, it's not really conducive, and sometimes we feel like we are losing our resources in trying to do something with governments when they really don't want to work with us. And I would make the case strongly to keep doing it. If we don't interact with governments, it's impossible for us to provide them with these new ideas, but also it's impossible for us to really learn what are the real restrictions government face to adopt new ideas. Maybe there are simple barriers that they are facing within their bureaucratic set, behind the laws they are obliged to comply with, and we need to be sure that we understand really why it's sometimes so difficult for them to adopt and implement new ideas, new ways of doing the things they want to do.
That's very helpful, Carolina. I think that sort of trying to think about the constraints. Akeem, do you have thoughts on sort of what constraints government faces?
Yes, thank you, Lindsay, and a great pleasure to join such a distinguished panel. And perhaps picking up where Abhijit just spoke on, poverty as a phenomenon often has less to do with the individual than with systems. And even though poverty is an absolute experience, I think it is in understanding how poverty is first of all understood. And you asked me about governments, so very often public institutions measure poverty. And this is the first challenge, I think, Abhijit, that you also spoke to, and Carolina. We have oversimplified, distorting metrics for understanding poverty. Who are the poor? Why are they poor? And very quickly you begin to see the intersection between poverty and inequality. And that's why it is very much a systems approach, I think, that we need to take. And it's, I think, in the nature of understanding what you can change, that you also address opportunity. Very often development views poverty as somehow a lifting people out of extreme poverty, and from there on things move on. And yet, the last 30 years have taught us an interesting thing. I mean, since 1990, when 93% of the world's poor people used to live in low-income countries, in fact, today it's, I think it is, I just want to make sure I get the number right, 60% of the world's poor live in middle-income countries. So we also need to understand how our economic development choices and pathways influencing the ability to reduce poverty or to amplify poverty through greater inequality. And I think later in our discussion, we will come back to perhaps more specific issues. And, COVID-19, I think, has been the great revealer of precisely these vulnerabilities that are so entrenched in the economic model, but also in the way in which we have tried to measure and tackle poverty, which is why, UNDP has this long tradition of looking at poverty from a multidimensional perspective. And I think that's the first step towards having a systems and systemic response to it. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Akeem. I think we've heard some really, really practical and intelligent ideas around sort of changing the narrative and understanding the system. Shamran, do you have anything to weigh in on for this question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lindsay. And also for me, such an honor to be part of this very distinguished panel. Yeah, I mean, if you look at BRAC's work over the last almost 50 years, and specifically with graduation, but even broadly with all the things that we've done, we've always had this idea that we need to stop looking at the poor as sort of recipients of aid, and switch that narrative to looking at the poor as sort of active agents change in their own lives and in the lives of their families and the lives of their communities. And specifically for BRAC, that's been mostly working with poor women and low-income women. And we see how much investments there can make a difference. And that's been our experience for a long time. But I mean, working with now, several governments, obviously with the government of Bangladesh for a long time, but now with 10 governments over the last several years on graduation, we've been trying to integrate and incorporate sort of graduation thinking into government poverty reduction programs, economic inclusion programs. And of course, it's probably worth saying that no two governments are the same. So we talk about governments, but governments are very different from one to the next. And also governments themselves might seem like large monolithic things, but they're not, right? And when you go and work with governments, I think there are opportunities for non-governmental actors to make significant contributions in working with governments. So some of the things that's worked well for us, for example, when we've worked with governments, looking at targeting, for example, right? So, I mean, we'd like to think most governments want to get to the 2030 goals. They want to end extreme poverty. But in a lot of the very large-scale programs that governments are running in many of our countries, the targeting typically tends to be quite poor and quite basic, right? To the point where we've seen programs in our country where the government's investing lots of money, but when it comes to targeting, they just do like, a certain number per district, per sub-district. So really not taking into account at all that there are differences in poverty rates from one district to another. Certain parts of the country have more people living in the Middle East and sending back remittances. And some of these sort of very basic types of targeting means that a lot of people who shouldn't be in these programs tend to come into these programs. So there's sort of inclusion and exclusion errors. And we've had some success in working on the targeting side. Also on the design side, obviously making sure that these programs are actually designed for the poorest based on community needs, looking at a bottom-up way of designing some of these programs. Also working with multiple different parts of governments because different ministries and different departments all have different strengths and different leverage points. And sometimes it's easier for us going from the outside, going into some of these silos and trying to get people and governments and departments to work together to build meaningful collaboration, to do some of the things that need to be done. And of course, lastly, I'll say obviously on the innovation front and also with a lot of the new technology coming in and integration of some of that. Also, I think we as non-governmental actors, I think have a lot of role to play in that. So yeah, I think I totally agree with Abhijit's point that there needs to be a change in the mentality of the way we look at poor people and to move it from sort of dependence to resilience. But I think after that, there are concrete things that we as non-governmental actors can do, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamran. I think that was a great transition to the next topic of our discussion, which is even with these varying poverty contexts that exist pre-COVID, we started to talk about what COVID has exposed. And I'm curious to hear from each of you, and I'll start again with Shamran. What has shifted in terms of program implementation because of COVID? How are we changing? Are there things that are making us hopeful or things that feel worse in terms of addressing these problems? Shamran, over to you briefly, and then I'll call on the other panelists.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I think, Amina Mohammed was right when she said that, COVID has completely exposed the fragility of our economic system, right? And I mean, if I look at, some of our own experiences, the fragility of the lives and livelihoods of people, especially people living in poverty and low income settings, has been exposed. And also it's exposed the weakness of some of our existing systems. So obviously, we'll see more poor people, more people pushed into poverty. But I think there's also cause for hope, because I mean, if I've looked at our experience of working with the ultra poor and trying to build resilience and looking at how well they've managed to come through this crisis. Of course, the ultra poor women and extreme poor women, again, one of the worst hit by COVID, as you would expect. But at the same time, people, the families that have gone through our programs if they are now, if they have productive assets, if they are better integrated within their communities and they have social capital, if they're now financially included and have access to, and are starting to build a savings portfolio, starting to have access to credit or even insurance, when they go up to shops, because they've now got greater social capital and they ask for store credit, that they're more able to get it. They have more support from friends and family and neighbors, as opposed to before they come into the programs where we see that some of the ultra poor women are socially so excluded. All of that builds resilience. And one of the few sort of silver linings that we've seen in the last few months is going back and looking at how our ultra poor participants have coped with this crisis. Obviously, for a while, due to the lockdowns, there was a significant hit on incomes. But at the same time, through using some of these coping mechanisms that now have, they've been able to get through this period. And actually, some other groups who are typically not within our ultra poor communities, like for example, urban poor, in the non-agriculture, non-farm trade, have been hit so badly because their livelihoods have completely been taken out. And because we don't have good, comprehensive, inclusive, urban social safety nets and social protection in most of our countries, where most social protection is very rural focused, that's been one big area of need. So I think we can look at that and build on that. But I would just say that building resilience, it's just taught us that as we look at our future strategy, resilience has to be front and center of that.
So I would like to invite the other panelists. Abhijit, I saw your mic was off. I'm curious about sort of what do you see as innovation, perhaps, or more barriers because of COVID?
Well, I think that I very much agree with Shamran Bhai on the question that of sort of resilience. I do think that one from our own work, what I see is that there isn't. I think one shouldn't try to build systems for very large disasters in the same way as one builds systems for normal times. And I think we find, for example, we're doing an evaluation of a universal basic income program in Kenya for now some years. And one of the things we find is that precisely because the program works in a sense, it doesn't protect very much against a shock like this, because people don't hold on to the money. They spend the money, they invest it, they educate the children better, they run businesses, and when the economic system collapses, then in a sense, the people who are most hit are the ones who have small businesses. So in some sense, their incomes fall faster than that of everyone else. And that's not surprising. It's, in a sense, desirable that they have exposed themselves to that risk. In a sense, that's what we would want them. So in some sense, I think the building social support programs needs to, while I think it's important to build resilience, I think one shouldn't focus, I think there are different objectives being served here, and keeping those clearly separate in one's mind is important. There are programs to build for the long term. Mm-hmm. And then there are programs to build for emergencies. And I think those programs should not be the same program. And I think that's one of the insights we learned from, we went back and collected data online from, by calling people after the pandemic. And we find that just before the pandemic, the people who are doing the best are the ones who have crashed the most. And I think that's not a surprise, but it's one that tells us that, we don't want to use the same tools for everything.
Abhijit, I really appreciate that. And I'd like to actually invite Akeem to weigh in really quickly, and then Carolina, because UNDP has called for 6 months of universal basic income. That's an emergency response. And if you could sort of weigh in on what Abhijit has shared with us in terms of the difference of the remedies given the situation.
Thank you, Lindsay. Well, we refer to it as a temporary basic income because the world still is, engaged in deep philosophical, practical, and policy discussions about universal basic income. But the reason why we came out of essentially research in over 100 countries that UNDP has been leading as the technical support agency of the UN development system with these socioeconomic assessments is that we are in a real crisis right now, and the ability to contain the virus is largely premised on the ability of people being able to survive the measures that we have to take to contain it. Now, every country, every governance system is debating lockdowns and different measures, but the fact is you cannot ask people to cease being economically active if they cannot feed themselves. So the notion of a temporary basic income takes on a very significant role in, first of all, enabling us to contain the virus. And here, perhaps, Abhijit, it might be interesting to delve a bit deeper. I agree with you that something that is designed for a crisis may not be for a regular moment. But I think the second challenge we face right now is in essentially expending enormous amounts of money. That famous fiscal space and the mounting debt requires us to already use the crisis to also invest in systems that can carry us forward out of a crisis into a development recovery. And there it becomes very interesting, because the fact is that half the world's population has no social protection whatsoever, 4.4 billion. If you focus on the countries with poverty, developing nations, that proportion goes up to 60, 70, 80, 90%. In many developing countries, 80 to 90% of people operate in the informal sector. So add these two together and you have two critical variables that are also fundamental to development recovery that we could learn from the crisis measures. And the temporary basic income is, in one sense, an immediate measure to simply allow people to cope with a health crisis. But in investing in the identification of the poor and providing them with cash access, you can also lay the foundations for a more systemic social protection system, but also an economic transfer of resources that allows people to innovate, to invest, and to essentially recover from this crisis in due course. And that is something we are looking at very carefully right now. And I think innovation and allowing people to design the strategies in their own reality and pragmatically, I think is going to be fundamental to the success of this. But that's perhaps two thoughts to share.
No, thank you so much, Akeem. That's really helpful. Carolina, would you like to weigh in briefly on this question? And then we'll turn to our final discussion point.
Yeah, just two small things that we'll add to this. The crisis showed that the people that is already receiving social protection or social programs or any type of interventions to cope with poverty were better off in the crisis, because they were known, they were able to receive a cash transfer quickly, they were able to go to with their phone to use their bank account, and those were the privileged ones to receive aid. The ones that were just above them were unknown for most governments, didn't have a savings account or e-wallet available, and in several countries they didn't have IDs. So it was very difficult for governments to really build a rapid response to help those people that were not the ultra poor, that were really entering a very vulnerable situation due to COVID, because the railways, the basic railways, were not there. So I think IDs, having a social registry, having savings accounts or e-wallets for everybody, knowing the phones that of each citizen are becoming essential services that we need to put in place to ensure that we could build on top of that really rapid responses from governments and from civil society. Because if you don't know the people you need to help, it's a lot more tougher, and it takes very long periods of time to really deliver the aid in the right moment.
Thank you, Carolina. I think that's a terrific and very practical set of points. Our last discussion topic, and I'm going to invite Akeem to speak to it first. Given that there are shifting government priorities and changes in leadership of government, what are some effective ways that those of us who are outside of government can support long-lasting change for programs that really serve the poorest populations? Akeem, I'll turn to you first.
Well, perhaps just building off the previous discussion, I think in this crisis, we are seeing an extraordinary phenomenon. I mean, there is a simultaneous governance experiment going on across the world that is probably without precedent in history, because
Right.
never have had different countries' economic systems had to respond. Now, in last year's Human Development Report, UNDP identified two key variables in terms of future drivers of inequality. One of them was digital, and the second was climate change. And I'll, at the risk of oversimplification, just use these two examples to perhaps look at how do you design and help governments, in a sense, invest a way forward out of this crisis while addressing these phenomena. And I think here, Carolina just spoke to, some of the digital lessons we have learned. I think we forget that most poor people still live in the rural areas, in the rural economy. So connectivity is fundamental. There is nothing to stop us in the next 2 to 3 years to essentially take fiber optic cables into virtually every village in the rural areas. It is a generational investment, but if you look at it in the context of the stimulus that is being deployed, and sadly, mostly in the rich countries, and rich countries with very little preparedness to also co-invest in poorer countries, we could do extraordinary things. And I think that possibility of coming out of this crisis with governments making a strategic and deep commitment to addressing connectivity and all that comes with it, the digital foundations of that economy of today in some ways and certainly of tomorrow, would be a massive way of investing in preventing greater inequality, because that's what the Human Development Report basically foresaw. If you don't address that inequality in the way it exists today, then it will simply amplify the situation. The second is that green economy narrative, taking climate change. You can either, oil prices are very low, fossil fuel prices are very low for countries that still have perhaps 60, 70% of their population not having access to electricity. This is the moment to build your, coal-fired power station, invest in, traditional mobility, or to invest in tomorrow's energy economy, but also in tomorrow's development opportunities. And this is where we certainly are very encouraged by the increased attention that governments are putting on these options. And really, the truth is, this is a moment of choice, extraordinary choices that need to be made by leaders under extremely difficult conditions to maintain a perspective and a vision that is informed not only by short-term crisis management, as Abhijit and all of my fellow panelists said, but by investing in a development pathway that reduces inequality and enhances sustainability. You will get already two filters that allow you to make very significantly different choices about where to invest scarce resources. And that is, I think, the moment in time that we find ourselves in. And the worst thing that could happen to us is that we kind of buy ourselves back to where we were before. We all know it, and we all know that the next time around it will be even worse, unimaginable as that may seem to many in this moment in time. So for governments, I think whether you're an NGO, an academic, a think tank, a United Nations development program, it is to help governments see possibilities, opportunities, risks, to manage complexity and uncertainty, because that is the order of the day. But leadership ultimately is informed and wise decision making. And I think this is where we see certainly the greatest opportunity out of this crisis right now. And we have touched in the previous questions on some of the aspects of that. So my thoughts on that question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hakeem. Abhijit or Carolina, do you want to weigh in on the question of sort of how do we really support long-lasting government policy change?
Yeah, let me start by saying, again, we need to ensure that now that governments have realized the need of these basic railways, they need to be able to perform in a crisis. We need to push harder to ensure that those railways are set. ID systems, phone coverage, internet access, digital, closing the digital divide. There are a lot of things there. But also, I think governments are able today to take on some of the opportunities the crisis has set. For example, in Latin America, we are the more urbanized region in the world. But today, most urban citizens are realizing how really valuable is having this small rural sector that really feed us. During the crisis, we did not have a food supply problem because most family farmers we're still delivering food to the cities. And that has changed the position of rural sector and of agricultural sector to be in the policy discussion. So we need to use that advantage to really rethink how we are really addressing the problems and the restrictions family farmers have in countries in Latin America. And the other thing I would like to say is that this crisis has opened a great deal of opportunities to innovate very quickly and to test for different things. Our economic inclusion program, the social program that is similar to the graduation approach, has prepared an express version of it to really restore productive assets for those who have lost them during the lockdowns. And that is a simple idea, a very quick idea that could be put in place, but if civil society, NGOs go with that type of innovations and do the evaluation, build the evidence, create the narrative for those, we could have a great improvement in how we do things from the public sector.
That's very encouraging, Carolina. Abhijit, would you like to sort of have the last word on this policy question of what do we do to sort of support long-term policy change, or is that an unfair question? Given
No. I mean, I think that other than the fact that I completely agree with Carolina on everything she said about building the railway, I think that my sense is that it's going to be, whether we like it or not, it's going to be several years where governments are going to be quite careful about where they spend. I have been railing against being careful in multiple countries and with no success. And I say that I think that somehow people are feeling very kind of fiscally battered, and therefore they're going to be. So I'm pessimistic about the plans for big changes coming about in this moment, unless we pick our targets. And my sense is that where I think there might be still a lever is precisely on these questions of, imagine there is another pandemic. What would be the steps to take? I think that's where I think there is a moment to be grabbed. And I think on both sides, I think we've talked about poor country governments, but I think one of the places where I think it's very important that we make the plea and we guide the conversation is in creating a global fund for such emergencies. I absolutely think that this is a complete, the fact that this is a moment where, you talk of countries sort of repositioning their aid. Take the prominent example of the UK, to be more strategically useful rather than dedicated towards poverty is tragic in a sense, and it's exactly the wrong direction. In a sense, I will feel that this is a moment for the world to realize that the next crisis, as Carolina said, would be even worse. And I think those crises are what where our shared sort of destiny on a very fragile planet are taking us. So I think that to have we need to have a global conversation which leads at least to creation of some resources that can be drawn on in this crisis, where you see that the rich countries were perfectly happy to spend money on themselves, but none of the money pretty much trickled to the poor countries where it would have really helped a lot of people who are starving, who are really suffering. I hope we think of it as this moment as being a moment of great embarrassment for the world. We were inept and we were ungenerous. I think that's how I think of this moment.
Abhijit, I so appreciate your directness and candor, and I think that BRAC and the people participating in this call and watching this live stream are eager to take up the kind of challenge that you're framing. while at the same time, I think, hopefully sharing your realism and your concerns. I want to thank each of the panelists. I feel that we could talk for hours and hours, and we've already run a bit over time. So thank you so much. I want to thank our live stream audience. And then we'll be inviting the workshop groups to stay on to go a bit deeper on some of the other topics that we'll be looking at in more depth, turning to each of these items for more robust discussion of them. So thank you to the live stream audience. If you want to learn more about BRAC Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative or JPAL, just Google us or follow us on social media. We have wonderful newsletters and lots of information. And this video will be available on YouTube for you to share and see and review again. So thank you to each of the panelists. And thank you to our live stream audience. And I'll invite the participants to stay on.